particular can have discussions about the details and how they fit together. This approach of using computer models is really how we design most big complex things in our society that work. Bridges and buildings and aircraft. Most of the reasons why they work is because we make the mistakes virtually rather than.
But Jake, can I interrupt one more
Yes.
time, please? I mean, when you use the example of bridges and aircraft and bridges and all that stuff,
Yeah.
the one factor you don't have that we're dealing with here is there's some evolutionary component to what we're doing here, whether it's a result of climate change, whether it's a result of invasive species. I mean, when you're dealing with a bridge, you could be designing the same bridge that was designed in 1820. One of the complicating factors of this, and I hope is part of your discussion, is so often we hear we use our salmon doubling goals, if you will, which are really the only real goal we have with salmon, but they were in a period of time, and given the factors that we've got, is that a realistic goal? I mean, certainly it's the only goal we have, so it's very important to me, but how do you plug in those changes that are essentially beyond our control?
Well,
and I don't mean to interrupt you, but that to me is a very important component of what we're doing here.
One of my professors in college was a bridge engineer, and he would always tell stories about how the evolution of bridge models and bridge design had changed over very long periods of time as materials had changed and expectations had changed. So I think actually in all of these areas, if you look at the history of them, they're subject to many of these kind of problems. I think it's also necessary to point out that it took us in many cases 100 years to figure out how to get models we really feel are completely reliable. So we're still at the early days, I think, on many of the biological systems for much of this.
Isn't it true that one point about modeling is that with so many factors, as Charlie points out, that you have to take into account, doesn't it help us define which factors have a larger order of magnitude effect on the outcome? Isn't that one of the values of modeling?
I think with a very large complex system such as the Delta, if everything is important, if every little detail is important, there's no chance we'll ever get it right. So we do have to find out what are the most likely to be the bigger drivers on the system, and we only have a limited amount of resources. It's very important to use models to focus that. And I think that brings up the last point on this slide, is that the importance of modeling for adaptive management. If you look at the really serious attempts to do adaptive management, they all have models as a central element to help integrate that knowledge and make mistakes quickly, inexpensively in modeling land before you go out and do things in the field, because it's very expensive and hard to do things in the field, and because you have to regulate them also. On the next slide, please. Oops. Now onto some sort of near-term recommendations. How can we get more useful insights from modeling efforts? First is show how the delta works. This comes a little bit to the previous question, and hopefully John's animations are a good example of this. A lot of policy discussions are not really based on a full understanding of physical processes in the delta. It probably never will be, but some of them are based on notionally physical processes. We need to develop more of a common understanding of how the delta works. There's a lot of folklore about the delta, and so one of our recommendations is to develop a library of visualizations that help establish some fundamental understanding of what's important for the delta and how it works. And it provides an ability for policy discussants to more formally think about these issues. Models must be documented and interpreted more critically. There's a lot of models on this system. Very few of them have a complete set of documentation and testing. We're getting better at that, but I think a lot of the work does not receive that kind of scrutiny. A lot of models exist that can provide a lot of insights, but when these kind of model results are presented to you, they should have more thorough documentation, be much more explicitly tested, and be more thoughtfully and critically interpreted. So along the lines that we've been talking about already. This is, I think, is true not only for the model applications that you'll see here, but also in the model development process before they come into this room. Number 6, each model application should include strengths, weaknesses, and limitations. All model results are imperfect. Modelers should the modelers that come and present stuff to you here, they should be the most knowledgeable people about the weaknesses of their models. If they're not willing to tell you about that, that's a problem. That's a problem of trust, and I think a rightful problem. Inadequate presentation of weaknesses and limitations reflects poorly on the model and on the modeler. Boards and agencies should insist on more complete interpretations of results, including weaknesses. You know, if you go to buy a car from somebody, if they're not telling you any weaknesses of an old car, you know, you want to have someone else take a look at that car. So, and John has already suggested some tests for hydrodynamic models, and we have some more in the report. Number 7. So this is a hard question for you all. What are we looking for? You know, when we're modelers, we're trying to explore this space. These very complex physics, hydrodynamics, economics, biology. We're trying to explore this space and find useful, promising solutions. What are we looking for? What kind of delta do the policymakers want to see? It helps us find things if we know what we're looking for. So, and I know it's hard for you to say what we should be looking for because maybe you don't exactly know and there are a lot of uncertainties. So we have to have kind of a dialogue, I think, here over probably a fairly long period of time. But I think a lot of our modeling work, certainly our model development work as well, can be better focused and be more useful to the policy level if we can get out of you a better idea of what you're looking for in terms of what kind of delta do you think you'd like to see for the state of California. Yeah. If we don't have clearer statements of what we're looking for, then you'll basically see model results that present what different stakeholders are looking for. And maybe that's not so helpful to you as it could be.
If I could jump in there for just a second. I think this comes back to a question that was raised earlier, and that if you...
John, is your microphone on?
If you don't have a very clear statement of what you're trying to analyze, you might inadvertently accept some restriction in a model that should be flexible and be varied within an analysis. For example, in CalSim, you might present a question to CalSim, pursue it, get a result, and find out, hey, the thing I was asking about really didn't have much impact. But actually, if the question that you asked may not have had enough flexibility to operate because there were some rules that constrained it. And we did an analysis of how you could mitigate the impact of island failures with salinity intrusion. And under the CalSim assumptions that we were using, there was a very limited range in the reservoir releases because you always wanted to stay within the hydropower generation. It's very expensive to go outside of hydropower generation bounds and just release water out of the reservoir. So you don't want to do that. So they chose, okay, let's not do that. So we found out, well, you can't really do anything about salinity intrusion with the reservoirs. But I'm suspicious of that because, well, wait, there was a lot of flexibility we did not experience. That's one example, but I think that's across any modeling activity, is that you have to think about, well, what am I asking? And kind of, forgive the jargon, but what am I asking? Are the boundary conditions of my model far enough away so that I haven't already determined the answer because the inflow that I gave it is exactly what shows up at the station I'm monitoring for this test result, and it was what I told it? Is the question I'm asking within the physical or within the physics of the model to be represented accurately, or is that part of the model already empirically tuned so that it will always give you this answer when actually you should be using a model that represents that mechanism in a more physical basis? Are you trying to do a modeling exercise to explore some flexibility that just is not in that model, or is in there in some strange accidental way? There was a mention of a reservoir operation model that you do a small tweak on it, and then suddenly it goes in some other mode of operation altogether. And it wasn't a small change, it was some jump into another state. Why did that happen? And this is a very challenging task, I think, for particularly as you go up towards the large-scale operation ramifications of objectives in the Delta, where you're trying to meet flow requirements, and you have to deal with the complexity of the system as a whole. Is there enough enough information in the model to represent those changes in a physically realistic or operationally realistic or policy realistic manner. And I think that's not something we can answer. I think every modeling exercise you should address that.
You know, what Jay was asking the question is what kind of delta we want. So often in our conversations, we hear about anadromous fish from one group, we hear about pelagics from another, and I have yet to hear a melding of what would be the optimal condition for both, knowing that there would be give and take from one type to another. And at some point, that's going to have to be part of the discussion, because we hear people talking about the fish in general. We hear them, as I said, talk about anadromous and pelagics, and I think you all know better than I that one flow regime might benefit one, you know, to the disadvantage of the other. And so, you know, we don't have the luxury of picking and choosing our endangered species on this, which really gets down to the most difficult part of all of this. So.
This modeling, I think, is really part of a very long historical dialogue, but that'll have to be going on, I think, between the policymakers and the scientists, the technical people, about how the system works and how it's changing and what we want as a society. And certainly you can look back for 150 years and see that what we've wanted out of the Delta has actually changed quite a lot. And it'll probably continue to change in the future. And we're just trying to keep up with all that, both, I think, as technical people and as policymakers. Let's go on to the next slide, please. The board can make better use of modeling, we think. Strategically, we're recommending you consider developing a group of independent experts to advise you on modeling issues. How do you want to bring model work, model ideas, model results into your deliberations? You know, give that some malice of forethought before the presentations start coming in to you. Employ some independent experts to assess and summarize the body of presented modeling results. Maybe this is an in-house group of experts that you want to maintain. Maybe it's a group of external experts or a hybrid that you want to convene to help you sort through all these modeling details that you can have a nice conversation with. And then encourage stakeholder groups to present consolidated, organized, and documented sets of modeling results with syntheses for policy. Just noticing the way board agendas seem to look, you have just almost a shotgun blast of testimony and testimony results coming at you. A lot of these folks could probably be more effective and easier deliberations quite a lot if they had some incentive to consolidate their comments and reconcile them down a little bit. And then finally, have independent technical assessments to raise the overall quality of testimony and insights from results. I think having these kind of independent technical experts around and forcing some consolidation of stakeholder presentations would sort of raise the bar up in terms of the expectations of scrutiny that you would have when modeling results are being presented. 9, the state needs to plan for Delta-related modeling. Basically, every agency has its own technical, well, I'm not sure they do have technical plans quite often. Often different parts of the same agency seem to have different technical plans. This is a very big problem that the state's going to have for a very long time. The state should have a plan for how to organize this problem and how to go after it from a technical perspective. The state needs a plan that will have both a near-term modeling efforts and testing and a longer term, sort of the 5 to 15-year plan for developing and testing models and data. Modeling needs for this system exceed the capacity of any one agency. No single agency is going to be able to give you what you need. No single consulting firm, not even a single university will be able to do this. So the approach taken should be community-based. And community-based process will involve quite a wider range of people working together to resolve some of these issues with much more common data sets for testing. And some of that should dampen, providing a more public, community-based scientific basis for deliberations should dampen some of the combat science that we see quite a lot of. So the next slide that sort of talks a little bit about community-based modeling, where we have more than one developer, more than one party being involved in the development of these models, much more public availability and scrutiny of these models. Something that came up, we discussed quite a lot, that I think is quite important, is the development of a common data set, particularly in the hydrodynamic and water quality models, a common data set where you can test and compare some of these models. We're going to have a lot of different models in this system. To some degree, that's a good thing. They're each different tools. They have different benefits. But you ought to have a data set that allows you to compare and see which ones work better when. Gives ourselves some scrutiny and a little more honesty in some of this. And much better documentation. So next slide, please. Preparing for the future. So the last set of recommendations. The delta is a changing problem. And so we're going to have to make our models and our data improve over time to address these questions and update the changes in the system. And I like this cartoon a lot. I see quite a lot of it among our modelers that are so busy preparing for the next set of board hearings, perhaps, that they don't have time to really think about how could we make this whole enterprise work a little bit better in the long run. So I think there's a lot of misdirected attention in that sense. Next slide, please. Integrating our understanding of this very complex system is going to require having some integration of our models. This is not to say that we want to have one Uber model that has everything in it. I don't think that would be a good idea. But to have a little bit more malice of forethought in how these models are going to fit together and how the results are going to fit together to give us a much more complete understanding of the system. Integrating these things should be able to make it easier to find some insights and solution across model boundaries, allow us to better evaluate the implications of different proposed solutions, and help us test the models and the model results and the insights that we get out of these models. This is going to require, just like the state planning for models will require much stronger state leadership than what we've seen across several agencies.
And do you see that leadership coming from, I mean, I would say it's probably more than just one agency as well. So where does the leadership come from?
I think that's a really good question. That's a very good policy question, actually. The state board is in a position to motivate the state to develop that leadership, I think. But it could reside in any one of several places, or perhaps in several places under an umbrella.
What has been the relationship between the modeling community, who many are represented here, and other forums like the Interagency Ecological Program, San Francisco Bay Regional Monitoring Program?
Who's our...
I think where...
microphone.
The primary collaboration that we've experienced just from our own consulting firm has been on a project-by-project basis, and generally we'll work with an agency or interest group on some problem, and that requires us to collaborate with groups within the IP or the USGS or DWR or others. That we often have our heads down, so we're not aware of what everyone else is doing. But once the collaboration begins, I think I'm hesitant to say we couldn't do better, but I think we gained tremendous insight from crossing over and like working with John Bureau in the USGS and sharing our needs of, this is the data we need to drive this process. You don't have all that data yet. Can you get it? And then John works with groups, funding agencies, to try and add stations. So this process is going forward. Pete, you're working with an interdisciplinary group on SMELT individual-based modeling now. Maybe you could say something about that and how that works.
Yeah, in my experience over the years, actually a lot of the motivation for collaboration between the modelers and the biologists has come through the Interagency Ecological Program over the years. You know, I worked with that group for several decades, and yeah, right now there's an effort to develop a delta smelt life cycle model, and we have a team of biologists and ecologists, and I'm the hydrodynamics guy. And we're integrating hydrodynamic modeling, you know, to move delta smelt around within regions in the delta. and then incorporate all the biology. So they do take place, these efforts, these multidisciplinary efforts, but we always need to do a better job on that.
What would you say are some of the motivations, the drivers for getting, resources together to do the modeling effort, to work with the required monitoring programs?
Well, like in the case of this Delta Smelt life cycle model, that basically came out even in the Wanger courtroom, that the federal agencies were a bit remiss in that they didn't have a sophisticated life cycle model. So I think some of the motivation came from, those court hearings saying, in your next revision of the biological opinion, you need to have you should have a model of this kind. So it's driven by everything from politics to science. In this case, I think it's important in both instances. We need those kind of models to do the science, but it's also important, to have those kind of tools embedded in our decision-making in the biological opinions.
I could probably say something about this also, but not as a member of QEMF, but instead my personal modeling. The incentive to work on a nutrient model came out of the ammonia problem. And so it was actually Metropolitan Water District provided some seed funding, and then additional funding has come through, I guess, in some sense, almost personal interest. If you're interested in a particular portion of the system, John's interested in hydrodynamics and salinity and particle tracking, and I'm interested in water quality. So you find partners to work with, but it's not a very efficient way to push development forward. As part of QEMF, what we try to do is we try to bring disparate groups into the room, people that normally have different sets of lawyers to talk to each other, but as you'll hear later, we're a small organization and volunteers, so we don't really have funding to push an effort forward.
Another example, if I can take a few more minutes, is recently for the restoration of Prospect Island Fish and Game and the Ecosystem Restoration Program, pulled together a number of experts who had run the DRERIP models, the sort of set of conceptual models, and they had contracted with RMA to produce the hydrodynamic models. And we used these models in real time as we came up with questions for them, and they essentially ran the models. They went through and they gave us the kinds of animations and the kind of insights that they provided to you just now in nearly real time, responding to our questions. And this made for a really powerful sort of collaborative effort in terms of the DRERIP experts being able to formulate through those models what the uncertainties were and make some sort of robust decisions about where the restoration of Prospect Island might go. And we felt like it was a fairly good effort given the complexity of this initial restoration effort and given the demand that X number of thousand acres needs to be restored in the future. So that's just given those kinds of requirements sort of forces these sorts of interfaces to occur.
I think these examples illustrate the fact that scientists find the interdisciplinary questions, or there's certain applications that require interdisciplinary approaches, and then these things are merged and pursued. But I think what we're speaking to here is a broader sort of strategic vision as to how all these things fit together, and that's where I think we see the whole is at an individual level. We find the project, we find the connections, and we push the science forwards. But it's more about thinking longer term about what the system needs over time.
I guess I would summarize it as saying that our interdisciplinary efforts along these lines have been sporadic, usually motivated by court cases or other kind of crises, but they've certainly not been systematic or sustained in a broader sense, which is, I think, a long-term problem for the system.
Following up on Stephen's questions, do you have specific suggestions for the board on how we might encourage this cooperation? I noticed that in your submittal, I think you estimated, $3 million a year for the next 5 years in terms of funding and resources that might be needed. Now, obviously, we don't have $3 million just sitting around. what other recommendations do you have for us to ensure this kind of cooperation?
You know, along the lines of the state needs a plan for developing this. And it's not just the state board. I think the state board, it might be doesn't have the funding position, I think, for this kind of a plan, implementing such a plan. But I think it's in a position to motivate the development of a plan that would be developed presumably by some other agencies, perhaps with participation from the state board.
And maybe I'm being a bit slow, but how might such motivation take place?
My understanding is that a lot of the IEP is, and their data collection, their work in that area is motivated by state board requirements. You might extend that to include some modeling work development in a sustained way.
Let me take a shot at one of the problems. This is Greg Gartrell. In the question you asked, because a lot of what you need to do, for developing models or developing understanding, is not yet known. For example, if we knew that we were going to be looking intensely at ammonia and nutrient problems 20 years ago, we'd had a different model or a different monitoring program for the past 20 years. You find out when you have a problem what you should have been modeling and what you should have been monitoring over those years. And some of the things that will come up in the future we don't know about yet, and we will always have this difficulty of the data that are available don't match what we need to know now. So it's going to have to be adaptive as you go along. Now, that said, there are things that you can do if you step back and look at, for example, the monitoring that goes on from wastewater discharges. That's a different issue, but there's a lot of data there that can be incorporated into other monitoring programs, for example, from the IEP program. My experience is getting the programs that are established to change into more comprehensive ones is difficult. After the Bay Delta Accord, I bent a couple of picks trying to get some changes with others in the IEP program, and I kind of gave up on that. And it keeps coming back, well, you should be doing this. No, they want to do what they have been doing because they don't want to lose that data set. That's valuable, but getting new information and new monitoring programs in there with the same funding or sometimes less funding than you have is a tough row to hoe.
Yeah.
There's going to be a Delta science plan in the coming year, I understand. So maybe this has some potential to be of use in this kind of a process. In terms of expenses, there's a lot of very good people working in this system, but they often don't work together. So I think a forum or kind of a plan that would allow that to happen would probably be, everyone should be able to find that to be useful, I think.
That was going to be my question to Dr. Goodwin, because a big part of the Delta Science Plan should address this in addition to, and I wanted you to talk about where it does and where it doesn't in your estimation looking forward, but also the convening function of the council that the Delta Council will pull together of all the agencies is precisely meant to deal with issues such as this, operational and looking forward, and that unfortunately was something that we couldn't get to until after the plan itself was done. So this is a part of the reason why the Delta Stewardship Council was created in the first place. So any observations you have, Peter, even future questions to ponder would be helpful.
Sure, just to make a few very brief comments. I think that this difficulty that you're hearing is prevalent. It's very common wherever you go in the world, wherever you go in the US. However, in the last 3 to 4 years, we're beginning to move to this totally different paradigm shift. So if you hear, for example, the NSF talking, the National Science Foundation, in their mind, and you'll hear many of the leaders saying that science is a team sport, period. And so that is now being diffused across many of the other federal agencies with research missions. So the idea is that if you have these community models, if you're sharing data in a timely fashion, our ability to accelerate knowledge discovery, our ability to communicate those findings across all levels goes up by several orders of magnitude. So without spending a lot of time, there's a lot of very good initiatives underway. I think we should definitely support and enhance those thinking that is still very much in the formative stages. The regional monitoring plan, for example, the CDN, some of the data management systems which are being put together. I think one of the things we should be looking at, these are very important. We should enhance, we should support those efforts, but at the same time take a look at the broader picture. So is the underpinnings of these data sets in such a way that it will be easy to connect data. As Dr. Gartrell said, we don't know what those future problems are, but when they come, there's likely to be different databases and monitoring programs, each having part of the picture. So rather than having to spend millions of dollars in the future creating those links, if we can get ahead of the game and really think about the cyber infrastructure connection, how we can communicate across different branches of science, how we can communicate across different entities that have different focal areas, we're going to be in a much stronger position. So I could talk a lot about that, but the short answer is yes, of course, the Delta Science Plan, we are tasked with taking a hard look at these issues. How can we enhance the collaborative approach, the accessibility to data, because instead of having one model, if you've got 40 or 50 different people in different agencies looking at the same issues, you're going to get much better products much faster. And Mark, you've been involved, or others who've been involved in some of this national thinking, maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think just the one thought that your comments sort of brought to the fore for me is the idea that when working on an individual science project, modeling project, whatever it might be, many times the endpoint of that doesn't include the steps that it would take to make the results more widely available. You can release your data, but that doesn't make it accessible. Big data sets aren't accessible to everyone. And so I think building some of that into even short-term projects is a way to facilitate future interactions. So part of a short-term application-oriented project might be to feed it into this larger database or this larger community. And to make that explicitly part of the individual projects could help to build that over time.
Peter, one of my pet peeves that many of you have listened to in the past is the fact that as we move forward with all these processes and all these hundreds of millions of dollars, we as a state, with the exception of the salmon doubling goals, don't really have a salmon policy. And I coordinated a meeting about 6 months ago that I thought would help initiate the development of that policy, and it fell on its face so hard that the thud was resounding. Does it seem odd to you that we're going through all of this when one of the primary species is salmon, and we really don't have a coordinated policy between the state and federal agencies that all have a hand in this? We certainly have as much authority as anyone would want to have in making these determinations as how we modify things as we go forward. But it just seems totally contrary to me that we don't have a more defined policy. And like I said, my efforts to try and get that done have been without any success at all. Does that seem odd to you?
Well, of course, that's a wonderful question. And in the first workshop, you really stimulated it. I think, Chair Hoppin, it was actually your comment initially that started that dialogue between the science panel. So how can we improve the outcomes at the science policy interface? Yeah, I think you make a very good comment. We as a science community can provide the scientific basis for which decisions can be made, but how you then take it to the next step to actually implement it, you requires a lot of thought. And I don't know of any others of the
my guess is that sorting out what is science and what is policy is at the heart of why sometimes science questions, which seem obvious, like a policy for salmon, it may not be the science that's the problem. It's maybe that it's embedded in policies that are not adaptive, are not flexible, are not responsive, and so that's when it gets thrown back at us. And so I guess the scientists have to help us sort through what is policy and what isn't.
I think it's always an iterative process. You know, we're often presented with policies that scientifically just might not work, and you know, and sometimes it'll take a long time for that not to work, and that's just fine in terms of policy. And oftentimes we'll have suggestions that really are not relevant to the policy issues. So I think there's always a long dialogue. These are very long historical discussions.
I think part of that, Jay, at least in my mind, is it's easy to identify an end goal. But as all of you know, all of you in the audience know, things take a great deal of time, and the interim period between today and the time we reach that final goal is an adequate period for the demise of a lot of these species we're talking about. So part of all of this, to me, is an interim plan, and that was what I had hoped for with my failed ideas about the salmon policy, is that while we held the salmon doubling goals up as something that I think no reasonable person would refute, we've been so dismal in our failure of achieving it, we need some interim policy to try and bridge the gap between the day we get to utopia and today. And that has to be part of this as well, because it's, like I said, it's easy to talk about an end goal, and I think you see a lot of people agreeing with the end goal, but the interim period is, you know, when you get to be my age, you think about interims rather than you think about the end goal, because the end game isn't too encouraging, you know.
Yeah, and perhaps just to add a thought to that, we'll never have the perfect answer. The science will never be perfect. And as you pointed out, this is such a dynamic system. So the only chance that we've really got of making this work is through adaptive management. And having trust and faith in a system that's going to work so that we can make these decisions in the face of uncertainty, get early understanding of particular trends or processes before something becomes disastrous, is probably the only shot that we've got. The challenge is, I think, here is to make adaptive management work at this level, because I'm sure you're all aware that to actually implement adaptive management, one in this complex system, and to make it work, the track record of these large projects is not good. So the question is really, what can we implement here with all of the technologies, all the intellectual capacity? 10 of the top 50 universities in the world are here in California. So yes, this is a complex system, but if we can't do it here, it really doesn't bode well for doing it anywhere. So I think that in order to make this work, taking a hard look at adaptive management, which is really the science policy interface, why has that not worked in the past? What can we do to anticipate those difficulties and overcome them, in a way that can move us down the path where everyone can feel comfortable with the process and have trust in the process? That is probably the biggest challenge.
But in terms of adaptive management, if we are, and I think that's the direction to go, it's very hard to do adaptive management at the cusp of the maximum use of something, or the taking the most fish, doing that bell curve and trying to figure out how you do it at the top when you've got maximum production. We're really going to have to, it seems to me that conservative approaches, if we're going to use adaptive management and trust that adaptive management isn't going to throw us over the cliff too often, we're going to have to be more conservative, and that's very difficult from a political perspective.
John, you want to say something?
Yeah, you could tell. You know, policy requires some kind of certainty or stability to the ecosystem that you're dealing
Your
with.
microphone on?
I'm sorry. Policy requires certainty, and unfortunately, ecology and the natural system sort of brokers in uncertainty and variability. And really, the discussion that we're having right now is scientists saying, tell me what kind of estuary you want, and the policymakers saying, tell me what kind of estuary we got. And the truth is, this is an estuary made in clay. It's a very strange, dysfunctional system, as you know. We made it, and we are going to have to make concrete decisions about what we want. And we're going to have to incorporate things like the ESA, and we're going to have to incorporate the needs of water users and the co-equal goals. But honestly, this estuary can be made into what we want, and I think that we have to have that forward kind of thinking. It offends a lot of people, but I'm here to say it. We can decide, and we will be wrong, and we will make new decisions, and the science will tell us how we're wrong, and occasionally it might even guide us to tell us what we can do right. But it is a model in progress, and we're going to have to mold it.
I think we're really looking at how do we make better mistakes than we will make otherwise.
Yeah.
I'd like to get on to the rest of the presentation if we could.
We'll come back.
How would you feel if we sat here and didn't ask you any questions?
Yeah.
I mean, I know we've
I
thrown
tell my
everybody
students
off
every day is a
schedule little
qualifying
bit, but-
exam. So John, let's go ahead. I'm noticing the passage of time.
That's right. I have 2 minutes. I'll make this short. So we started by trying to look at some of the physics and really looking at the delta as a surrogate for all the modeling tasks you have to consider. First, why do you believe what a model might show you? How do you internalize or somehow get a gut feeling for how that model operates, what its abilities, its constraints are, and how do you use the models available to get a notion of the physical, actually how that system really operates. And then you're going to use this model to look at how to operate the system. And I want to show a few animations that kind of illustrate that concept. First is looking at that management of salt over the dry season, and then how water exports affect the distribution of source waters, which is a related concept, but it's also important to I think, some fisheries' interest. And then a first look at some residence time concepts, which I think will become more and more important in evaluating the delta and developing metrics that are useful for interaction with the fishery scientists. So salinity. Here I have an animation of tidally average salinity over a year, and this goes really fast, so I'll stop it a few times. This is January 2003. Blue is on the order of 100 EC, kind of Sacramento River water quality. This brownish yellowish color is on the order of 800 EC, which is kind of a typical San Joaquin water quality. And then the red will be around 1,500 or so EC, which is not very high for ocean water, but you'll see the ocean water kind of come in. So here's January. There's been a fresh water pulse. The delta is fairly fresh. And as this goes forward in time, it's April. There was another little pulse there, and the pumping starts. So here in June, the pumping is getting going. You see this freshwater corridor across the center of the delta. Frank's Tract is fresh. The Sassoon Bay is becoming salty, as it would. And then you have moderate EC in the San Joaquin River. As I go a little farther through the year, I don't know if you remember that slope of the salinity intrusion at Jersey Point. That's what's happening here. This is slowly getting saltier over the year. The salt begins to pour down Old River, and you still have the freshwater corridor coming through on Middle River. Now, as I go right out to the end, here, at the end of November, this is an endpoint. This is about the maximum EC that the operators want to have released at the exports. They spent the whole year getting to this point. They spent the whole year of management making water move in just slowly enough to get here at the end of the year so that when the fresh water comes again, it can then wash it all out again. It costs water, from a water operator's perspective, it costs water to maintain that salt at that level. And that was the balancing point that they had. So let's take another look at this. Sure.
Excuse me. Tried you for not having your microphone on. I guess I better turn mine on. You don't have a parallel model of this with the peripheral tunnel,
Yes,
do you?
we do. I
We're
didn't
going to
bring
see it.
though.
Can we see it side by side?
We could, but not today. I don't have it with me.
Okay. I would like to see that at some
Yes.
point.
And in fact, and all the rest of these pictures are also very interesting when you move that export point up to the north. So look at some more of these too.
Okay. And John, can I interrupt just for a moment? I just wondered what the chair would like to do. We're just about out of time, and it's been a great discussion, but we're sort of conscious that you've got a very full day. So would you like to continue with this presentation at the same rate, or would you like us to finish up in a set time?
I hate to sacrifice any of this discussion. I saw you working your work over there, Brock. You're the one that has to make sure we're done with this in 2 days, and sometimes I don't do a very good job of keeping my mouth shut.
I could take 5 minutes or a half an hour, depending on how many questions.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So this next picture, this is not a historic condition. This is an artificial test where we start with a system that had moderate river flows, and I just lock the river flows, and I go from 0 exports to maximum exports. Here's starting with 0 exports, and you see the Sacramento River coming and pouring out. Tidal mixing is coming here, so there's some tidal mixing bringing salt water into Sassoon Bay. The McCollum, there's a small McCollum flow. It pours out and it flows downstream. There's not a lot of McCollum water, so the general concentration of McCollum water is very low. And I should point out the colors here are percent source water. So this is a fingerprinting exercise. DWR does this with DSM-2 all the time, although you may not see it in a spatial context. And the lowest blue here, the cutoff is 1/10 of 1%. The San Joaquin River, it's largely San Joaquin River down in the far south east corner of the delta, and then it mixes out. And when I click go, I'm going to start cranking up the exports over 4 months, and you'll see this change. Please ignore the dates. They're really kind of meaningless. It's just happening over about 4 months. So here we're about halfway through. The Sacramento is being pulled down. The McCollum is being pulled down, and it's starting to break away. It's not going out to sea anymore. And the same thing with the San Joaquin, and the ocean salt is, or the ocean water is being pulled in a little farther. If I go all the way to the end of this animation, now you see what is kind of a end of season. This ocean water has pulled in. It's impacting Frank's Tract, Old River, a little bit of Middle River. The San Joaquin is turning and all goes out the exports. And the McCollum is turning and all goes out the exports. And this is a net flow phenomenon. If the exports are greater than the Sacramento and than the San Joaquin and the McCollum River, those will turn and go that way. And I think this is one of the things that changes radically if you move the export location somewhere else. Another look is how long is material in the delta? And now we're moving more towards a metric that you kind of throw at the wall and say, well, hey, who would find this interesting? If I let the water age by 1 unit per day when it's in the delta, I get a picture that kind of looks like this. This is January 1989. Water's moving quickly through the Sacramento River. So as we saw, the particles dribbled in at the top. It doesn't take too long to get from the entrance here at the American River down to Rio Vista. It's just a few days. But water elsewhere is sloshing back and forth. It can be there quite a while. So this color scale is going from 0 days up to 50 days. Some of the dead-end sloughs, the water stays there for quite a while. So let me go forward just a little bit. And in this year, the big flow happened to be in the end of March. So now you have water rushing through the Sacramento and out through Suisun Bay. It actually does that pretty quickly. The water's not in Suisun Bay at this time of year very long. At this particular context, or in this particular animation, exports were taking most of the San Joaquin water. So you have long residence times in Old and Middle River. So you have short residence times here in the San Joaquin as it's ripping around to port into the exports, short residence times as it's moving out to sea, and then long residence time here in the middle. If I go farther into the year, into the summer export season, it switches around. Now the exports are pulling the water south, and it's shorter residence time here, and it begins to get longer and longer in Suisun Bay. I think this is really interesting. I hope someone else here does too. There's a very interesting dynamic between what's happening, how long a process has to occur, whether it's time for a fish to grow in that region before it moves on to some other habitat, whether it's zooplankton being moved around. This is on a delta-wide basis. You can do a similar sort of thing in a more discrete region. So here's an example in Liberty Island. This is with no flow in the Yolo bypass, and this is with fairly low flow in the Yolo bypass from January 2010. So water that is in Liberty Island ends up in the upper corner being there about 7 days or so under these conditions. And when there's no flow in the Yolo bypass, it stays up there. It's mixing around. It's mixing with water from the Sacramento. There's some water being pulled out to the North Bay Aqueduct. And there's some minor inflows in ag exchange, but by and large it stays there. As soon as you get flow in the Yolo bypass, that material that was developing in Liberty Island begins to flow down and move out towards Suisun Bay. And you notice it's not headed for Frank's Tract very much in this condition. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be explored about these local restoration opportunity areas. Then where's the zone of influence of those areas? How long would material, phytoplankton, zooplankton, eggs and larvae remain in that area? Or how much interaction would they have with other parts of the delta? And this is, John mentioned this about the DRERIP exercise for Prospect Island. That's exactly what we were doing there. And this is just one illustration. There's a whole lot of ways to look at the system in this kind of regional influence context, and I think this is going to be a very active area of research in.
John, I'm not going to look at Brock rolling his eyes at me because I promised not to ask the question, but I assume this flow from the Yolo bypass is from natural flooding and not from a hypothetical flooding one borrow pit with a notched weir and everything. Is that correct?
Well, natural flooding, I mean, this was water going over the Fremont Weir.
Yeah. Is that what you're talking about in this diagram, or are you talking about a...
This is the current state. It's not one of the proposed states. Yeah.
That's all I wanted. Thanks.
And again, these are illustrations. Don't get too worried about the details.
That's reassuring.
But if there was this is a very low bypass flow. If it was a very high bypass flow, the water would just flush right out of that area, and it would go away very, very quickly.